Welcome to our discussion. We're so glad that you have joined us. My name is Norman Peckham, and I have with me a scientist, author, teacher, Dr. Ariel Roth. We're so glad that you can be here. This is the third in a series of three on the fossil record and creation. This time we are going to look at at five specific problems that you probably won't find in an evolutionary textbook. So what is the first one?
Well, we're talking about the fossil record, and those layers of rocks that we see out there sometimes contain fossils, sometimes they're very abundant. Some call the fossil record the most horrific graveyard there is. And there are lots of animals out there, and they arrange in different layers. Some go through the fossil record without a change. Some are very different at the bottom than they are higher up, than their closer relatives higher up, and so on. So that you need to analyze what is going on here in connection with this fossil record. But when you look at those rocks, one major thing that you notice is a vast difference between the upper layers. And this chart here represents those various layers out there, kind of in order in which you find them. And below the red line that you see towards the bottom there, we have generally just microscopic, very few fossils, and very different. Right above the red line, we have all kinds of animals, large ones, small ones, and so on. So keep in mind that major difference as we look at the fossil record.
Now, we have all of those major definitions of groups, the sponges, the worms, and all kinds of things down in that very low layer. But the idea of a gradual transition over a long period of time would imply that we need some links, that we should be able to see some links. Where are they?
Well, as we mentioned earlier, in general, the links are missing, especially between major groups and so on. But we have over 300,000 different species of fossils. We found millions of fossils, but some are the same species and so on. So we got all these different, when you have over 300,000 species, you're bound to find some that are closely related to others.
But isn't it true to get from species to a new species to a new species is relatively easy? What we're really trying to concentrate on is the major differences at those very low levels.
Yeah, well, and evolution is supposed to be just one small change after another.
Yes.
And so on. Some of those suggest, for instance, that there are intermediates between reptiles and mammals and so on. There are a few cases where they think they have some, but in general, we just see major gaps between the major groups. All may not be familiar with the classification scheme, so we have this slide here which shows you, we have species, of course we have smaller subspecies and so on, but the species are grouped into the next group, the genus, and the genera are grouped into family, and then family into order, and order into class, and the class into phylum. One phylum, and in plants they talk about divisions, and then we have the kingdoms. Now, an example of a class, for instance, would be in the mammals. Mammals are a class per se. We have, and they're different from the amphibians.
Yes.
Which are frogs. Phylum. An example of a phylum would, be the sponges, for instance. That's a phylum. Yes. Or you could have mollusks, which contain the snails. Phylum that contain the snails. So, and it's down here near these big divisions where we have this major difference, where we don't have any of these intermediates, where evolution needs them. This has been noted, and that's why so many of these leading paleontologists admit, hey, there is a problem here. But then occasionally an intermediate is found, and a lot is made of this, but these are usually closely related. Here's a report to tell you a little bit about what we have as we look at this. This is from a book by a famous paleontologist, George Gaylord Simpson at Harvard and so on. And he lists here how many intermediates you find between these various categories. Now, species, well, we have microevolution and so on. We'd expect to find changes, minor changes that aren't significant as far as the general theory of evolution is concerned. But the genera, you have many intermediates, as this table shows, and classes. Now we're getting up into some of the top categories. A few, phyla, none. And this is exactly where you need the greatest number of fossils.
If you're going to show that from a single organism through small changes over time, you have these huge changes, these huge groupings, we need some intermediates.
Yeah. If evolution had ever taken place, we should expect a solid continuity of these organisms trying to evolve, many of them not successful. Yeah. Mutations are often harmful, but a few of them make it and so on. But we don't find that solid continuity. It doesn't look like evolution ever took place.
Another point is the idea of the paradox of living fossils. I should ask, how old do I have to be a fossil? Is that it? Well, yeah. But what do we mean, living fossil?
Well, in order to be living fossil, you have to have a representative that's really quite old. So, in fact, we're talking about hundreds of millions of years. So maybe we don't qualify. Hopefully we don't qualify. But anyway, you look in the fossil record and you see a certain kind of organism, and you find, hey, that looks just like a living one. It has not evolved at all in these hundreds of millions of years. You have this chart here of this geolite column and so on. Way down at the bottom of the chart, the lowest fossil you can see down there, you probably can't read it, it's algae, it's way below that jagged line. There is a fossil you can find down at that level, way down in those rocks. And it looks very much just like a living counterpart. It's Oscillatoria. It's an algae. And when you look at the fossil, it looks just like the living one. And that's why you say it's a living fossil. Now, the question it poses is, well, why didn't it change over 2,000 million years? It's 2 billion years.
Yeah, all of that natural change and selection, it should have modified it.
You'd expect it. I would say, well, maybe it didn't. The environment didn't change and so on. But at the same time, you got to account for the fact that in 600 million years, you're going to have to go from a microbe to man in your evolutionary process.
Yeah. I remember when I was a youngster, there was they caught a fish down. I think it was down in South Africa someplace. Yeah, it was called a coelacanth, yes. And they were surprised because they thought that thing was long gone.
Yeah, well, and here they found a living one like it.
Yeah,
and it's that's another example of this. We have also. The horseshoe crab, 150 million years, looks just like our modern horseshoe crabs. We have a mite that was found 400 million years, looks just like a modern mite type thing. Here's a picture of that algae. 2,000 million-year-old algae there. It's the middle picture there, and it looks just like a modern one. Here's a picture of the horseshoe crab. And it looks just like the living crab when you find the fossil record. Very similar, no change over 150 million years. Makes you wonder about this evolutionary clock where mutations and so on are supposed to affect these changes over time and so on. The fact that evolution said, well, the environment didn't change and so maybe the mutations weren't effective and so on type of thing. It tells you a little bit about the flexibility of evolution because evolutionists have answers for an awful lot of different things that we find in the fossil record and elsewhere. Now, evolutionists accuse creationists of the fact that, well, there's no way to test creation because you have a God, and you don't know what that God did. And so anytime you have a problem, you just invoke God. Well, if we have a change, okay, it's evolution. If we have no change, the environment didn't change type of thing. And some of the explanations that evolution has are even conflict with each other. For instance, if man is aggressive and mean, that's because of his evolutionary ancestry from survival of the fittest type thing. If he's nice and trying to help his friends and his relatives and so on, it's because of the kin selection hypothesis, that you're trying to save your genes that are perpetuated through your close kin. So,
but how do you test that?
Well, so you see, both ideas in terms of this concept are kind of in the same boat. Yeah. As far, and this illustrates the fact that some things that evolution suggests are very hard to test scientifically, and I think really the hard data favors creation. I'm talking about things like the original life. How could it originate by itself? I'm talking about these erosion rates are way too fast, and so on. I'm talking about the fossil record. We talk about these gaps. Right. And there's a lot of hard data there that supports the creation model.
Okay, another point. We hear the word the Cambrian explosion. Well, why is that a problem?
Well, it's called the Cambrian explosion. Now, this is not an atomic bomb explosion, but it occurs in the Cambrian, and evolution is so slow, and all of a sudden, here we find in the Cambrian, and you can see in this slide here, the red line there is that Cambrian explosion. It's right at the base of the Cambrian, and all of a sudden there we find the major animal phyla.
Without the intermediates.
Without the intermediates. So we have a double problem here. One, not only do they appear suddenly, but we have no intermediates. You could have very rapid evolution, but you'd expect some intermediates there.
Some of them ought to be fossilized.
There are a few phyla below and above this and so on. But over 2/3 of the animal phyla appear all of a sudden there in the Cambrian. And evolutionists call this the Cambrian explosion. Well, all our animals should be connected together. They aren't. Yeah. If you go to the Grand Canyon, you want to know where the Cambrian explosion is. That arrow points out there where it is. Below that, all we have microscopic organisms, some questionable fossils, and so on. And above that, well, trilobites, advanced animals, ferns, all kinds of things above it. And that line there shows you that's where all of a sudden these major fossils appear, and we have this Cambrian explosion. This illustrates to you that this problem that poses, because we don't have billions of years for evolution at all. For billions of years, nothing happened in evolution. Here's this graph. So the evolution, time is that gray line. It's darker at the left, and so on. And way back there at 4,600 million years, the Earth is supposed to have originated. Then 3,500, some say much before that, but anyway, the first life formed. Okay. And then you have very simple life forms, where you go across most of that time till you get to that Cambrian explosion. In other words, during most of that time, we have no evolution to speak of. Essentially 2 billion years. We're still at the one-cell stage for most organisms after all that time. Then all of a sudden, you notice the thickness of that red line there, labeled Cambrian explosion. In that little time, we have most of the animal phyla appearing.
Well, that does not speak well for the idea of a one-celled organism having some little mutations that are selected by natural selection and a gradual uniform process.
The fossil record speaks of creation, I think. And let me come back to, we discussed the flood model earlier in this series here, and this is a picture of what the Earth may have been like before the flood. And you notice where we have the blue arrow pointing there, we have simple organisms. Above it, we have sea. Now, the bottom of that sea would be the Cambrian explosion, if it were buried during the flood. Above that, we've got land plants appearing, and so on, land animals appearing higher up. Then we have reptiles and so on higher up, and higher up we have the birds and the mammals, and we talked about that earlier. But what I want to point out to you is how well that fits with this chart we have here. The Cambrian explosion is that red line, which is at the bottom. The blue line represents where land things appear first, and between those two lines is where we have that sea before the flood with marine animals. This fits nicely with what we have in connection with the biblical account and so on. This is scientific data that can be interpreted to fit very well.
So we can look at this record and look at it through evolutionary glasses, and this record could support the idea of something coming from some simpler organism. But we could look at this same record through the eyes of a flood that was in a world where organisms lived in different ecologic zones,
and they were
gradually inundated,
destroyed as the flood waters rose higher and higher.
And we would be left with a record much of what we have.
Exactly. And these organisms are quite different in the lower part, had to have a place to live, and they lived lower down in the ecology of the Earth at the time of the flood.
Sure.
Some evolutionists have recognized a problem here. We don't have just the Cambrian explosion. We had explosion of mammals up higher up in 12 million years. Most of your orders of mammals appear. In another 12 million years, most of your orders of birds appear. And they call these explosions also. We got an Avalon explosion of Ediacaran. It's a little glitch in that red line you see down at the bottom there. But a fossil normally lives in the record about 1 million to several million years. And if you have only 12 million years for all the mammals, and I'm talking of mice, bats to whales, they're all mammals. How could that happen? You only have time for 12 successive generations if a species lasts 1 million years. And so the suggestion is made, well, maybe they branched off early, but if you had all this branching, you'd expect to see this in the fossil record, and we don't see it.
And we don't see it.
Well, here's a statement by an evolutionist regarding this. He's talking about how that all these mammals come about, he says, this is clearly preposterous to suggest that they all evolved. But then he tried to suggest some methods of rapid evolution, which have not been well demonstrated in the laboratory at all.
With all of these problems that that are obvious with the evolutionary interpretation of this data, does that drive some evolutionists? Does it bother them?
Well, some have another solution to this. You know, recently we've been doing a lot of sequencing of DNA.
Yes.
You know, and using this and ignoring the fossil.
So ignore the fossil record.
Yes.
It's a problem.
It's a problem. Because the molecular clock, you know, say things go quite slow according to their interpretation, and they find these great differences between these different phyla. And so they must have evolved from each other much further down than you find them in the fossil record. How much further? Often they suggest several 100 million years below the Cambrian explosion, or they'll suggest even 1 billion years.
But in doing that, they have to make the next statement, but none of the fossils survived.
Yes, well, they're not preserved there, you see. And so when they make their evolutionary diagrams like this cladogram, they'll just use the DNA, and they say, well, the DNA is so different here, they must have evolved long before between these different kinds of organisms. Or they will say, well, We don't have the data. The clock is probably not right in respect to this kind of molecule, and molecules differ in the rate of change, and so on. Then there are some others. You need to recognize there are some paleontologists, study fossils and so on, who don't agree with that. They study this carefully and they make these diagrams on the basis of the fossil record. And there are some fairly sophisticated and respectable interpretations to this, but this is based on the assumption of long time and based on the assumption that evolution did take place. Yeah. And there are other interpretations to this. The problem that we have here with this question is that the differences between groups of organisms can be very great. The molecular clock is very slow. It is postulated organisms should have evolved from each other long before one can find them in the fossil record. So we're speculating here. As we look at these, we see that we have fewer body plans as we go up the fossil record.
Now, a body plan is like what?
Well, it's a different type of organism.
Like a sponge versus a worm?
Yes. Or it could be, for instance, in this chart right here. Right in the middle of it, you can see a light blue fish, an ostracoderm. That fish is different. It has a shell, kind of a shell around the front end of it. Mm-hmm. No fish living like this. This is a different body plan for a fish. It's not an ordinary fish. So that's an example of a different body plan. But the interesting thing is that as you look at this fossil record, in the middle part there, which is the Paleozoic, which is where you have more body plans there than you have living now. Botanists, for instance, suggest, well, maybe we have 31 body plans down there, only 23 living now. Another study suggests 67 body plans of animals and plants in the lower part, and only 42 that are living right now.
But in the evolutionary model, shouldn't body plans increase, not decrease?
Well, this is the whole pattern of evolution, is that you start with simple organism, and then you form two different ones, and you more complicated ones, and so on. Stephen Gould, leading paleontologist, probably the most well-known advocate of evolution in the United States at Harvard, and so on. He has pointed out, he says, hey, our evolutionary trees are reversed. They're bottom side up. For a leading paleontologist to suggest that, it tells you a little bit about this problem. Now, keep in mind, there are lots of species, genera, more species, more genera at the top of the fossil record than you find lower down. Families even. Mm-hmm. And so you look up there, but these are easier to find, and probably the reason we have so many of them is that you don't have to dig down so far to find them. they're in the top. They're in the top of the.
But even creationists believe that you can get differences in cats, and so you can, at the species level, it's easy to get a kind of a new variety of the same species. But it's in those early ones down there between the sponges and the worms and the etc. where we need some.
This is where, you'd expect the greatest number of intermediates.
But they're not there.
And you have these different body plans, more of them down below there in the lower part of the fossil than above. This is evolution in reverse.
Let's kind of review just a little bit of what we said. We said we were going to bring up some issues, some problems that you probably won't find in the evolutionary textbook or for our public schools. There are major gaps without significant links in those major groups where we would expect to see them the most. The idea that old creatures that were in low levels as fossils show up today as living animals make it kind of hard to say that the evolutionary process all of a sudden didn't work for them, because they're the same as they are today. We talked about the Cambrian explosion, where instead of gradual changes, it looks like they was all brought into existence almost the same time. And it almost makes you think creation. And because of these problems, some evolutionists are now saying, let's forget the fossil record, let's go with DNA. But when they do that, they don't have the science behind it to explain what they're talking about. Well, I hope you've enjoyed it. We'll be back again when we have another search for where is truth. If you would like additional free information about these discussions, there is a PowerPoint resource available on the internet that covers many more details than could be provided in this lecture series. The resource is titled The Bible and Science and is available at scienceandscriptures.com. Be sure to add an S at the end of the word scriptures to get to the right web page. The Bible and Science resource follows the same sequence of topics as the Where is Truth series, but it is divided into 17 separate discussions instead of the 14 videos of the Where is Truth series. The title of the discussions, an introductory outline, and an index will lead you to the topics you want. The Bible and Science discussions served as the resource for the Where is Truth videos. To facilitate understanding and learning, each of the 17 PowerPoint discussions in the Bible and Science resource is provided with a set of questions and their answers. You will find these at the end of each PowerPoint presentation. The Bible and Science resource was designed especially for students and teachers. However, it can be of great help to anybody interested in the topics.